The first sign that something was terribly wrong wasn't the sound. It was the stars. Earl Hicks had spent enough nights beneath the Montana sky to know every familiar constellation by instinct. 28 years in the Marine Corps had taught him to navigate by them, survive beneath them, and trust them when maps failed. Tonight, they were moving, not across the sky as the Earth turned. They were falling, slowly, deliberately, like distant embers drifting toward the world. Earl leaned back in the old wooden chair on his porch, his cold cup of black coffee forgotten in one weathered hand. The mountains surrounding his cabin stood silent beneath the moonlight, and the towering pine forests remained perfectly still. There was no wind, no engines, no voices. The nearest town lay 40 miles to the east, and the closest neighbor lived 11 miles to the south. That isolation had been the whole point. 4 years earlier, Earl had retired with a military pension, bought a forgotten stretch of Montana wilderness, and made one promise to himself. No more orders, no more wars, no more saving the world. At 53, he believed he had earned that peace. The United States Marine Corps had already taken 28 years of his life. He had fought in places that officially didn't exist, completed missions history would never acknowledge, buried friends whose names would never appear on memorials. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, he had survived them all. Then another star broke formation. This one wasn't falling. It was slowing down. And for the first time in decades, Earl felt the old instinct awaken deep inside him. The instinct that whispered only one thing. Trouble was coming. He had 4 screws in his left knee, a scar running from his right collarbone to his shoulder blade that he told no one about, and a recurring dream involving a bridge in a country he was never officially in. He didn't sleep much anymore. That was fine. The porch suited him, but the stars were falling wrong. They weren't meteors. He knew meteors. He had watched them for years from this same chair. This was something else. A streak of deep orange light cutting across the sky at an angle that was too controlled, too deliberate, too aimed to be natural. It was moving fast, then faster. Then it was clearly losing altitude. And then a sound reached him. Not a boom, not an explosion, but something between a shriek and a groan, like metal being folded by a giant invisible hand. The impact shook the ground beneath his boots. Earl sat down his cold coffee. He looked at the orange glow rising from somewhere about 2 miles north, just past the ridgeline. He thought about it for exactly 4 seconds. Then he went inside and got his flashlight, his first aid kit, his toolbox, and 3 rolls of duct tape. He didn't know why he grabbed the duct tape. 28 years in the Marines had burned one truth into his bones, deeper than anything else. If it moves, and it shouldn't, use zip ties. If it doesn't move, and it should, use duct tape. He had never yet encountered a situation where this logic failed him. He drove his old truck up the dirt path toward the ridge, following the glow. He had absolutely no idea his life was about to become the most important thing that had ever happened to the human race. The ship was enormous. That was the first thought. The second thought was that it was beautiful in the way that something deeply broken can still be beautiful. The way a cathedral looks after a fire when the walls are still standing, and the stained glass is gone, and you can see the sky where the ceiling used to be. It had carved a trench through the forest, 200 meters long, uprooted trees like they were weeds, and come to rest half on its side against the far slope of the ridge. It was dark metal or something that looked like metal but caught the moonlight in colors that metal shouldn't. And it was clearly a craft of some kind, aerodynamic in a way that Earth aircraft were not, built for movement through something thicker than air. There were fires, small ones, running along the edge of a tear in the hull that exposed a glowing interior. Earl assessed the fires first. None of them were spreading. The ground was rocky here, not much fuel for them. The whole breach was bad, but not catastrophic. The ship had clearly held together better than it should have given the impact angle. He walked toward it, flashlight in one hand, because that was what you did. You assessed. You moved toward the problem. You didn't stand at a distance wondering about it. That was when the hatch opened. It fell outward with a hiss of pressurized air and hit the ground with a sound like a struck bell. And then 3 figures came out, and Earl Hicks stopped walking for the first time. They were tall, taller than any human by about a full foot. They moved on 2 legs and had 2 arms and a head, which was either reassuring or unsettling, depending on how you looked at it. Their skin, if it was skin, was a deep gray-green with a texture that caught the firelight strangely, like scales that hadn't fully decided to be scales. Their eyes were large, amber-cold, without visible whites. They were wearing suits that were clearly functional, not decorative, with panels and closures he couldn't identify. 2 of them were holding up the third, who was clearly injured. The injured one was making a sound Earl didn't have a word for: low, rhythmic, pained. Earl looked at them. They looked at Earl. One of them, the tallest, raised something in its right hand that was almost certainly a weapon. Earl held up his flashlight so they could see his face. He kept his other hand open away from his body. He had done this before, in places where no one spoke the same language, when the only thing that mattered was what your hands were doing and what your face was saying. "Easy," he said. "I'm not armed. You've got a man down. Let me help." They didn't understand the words. He hadn't expected them to, but the tone landed. It always did. The one with the weapon didn't lower it, but it didn't fire either, and that was enough to work with. His name, as far as Earl could replicate it, was something like Veith. He was the commander of the vessel, which had a crew of 7, 5 of whom were still aboard, 2 of whom were unaccounted for, and 1 of whom was the injured one being held up between his crewmates, whose name sounded like Sarah, and who had a piece of her own ship's interior lodged in her side. Earl found this out over the course of 40 minutes, using the universal language of pointing, holding up fingers, drawing in the dirt with a stick, and very slowly and clearly mouthing words. He had no expectation they understood. Soldiers from different countries had always managed to communicate the important things. The important things were always the same. How many? Where? How bad? What do you need? Sarah needed the fragment removed and the wound closed. Earl had done this before. Not on a species like this. Not on biology he'd never seen. But the fragment was metal. The wound was bleeding something that was dark and thick, but behaving like blood, and the principles of field medicine did not fundamentally change because the patient had amber eyes. He worked by firelight and flashlight. VTH watched with the weapon still in his hand. Earl paid no attention to the weapon. He had learned a long time ago that paying too much attention to a weapon made people more inclined to use it. When he finished, when Sorrow was cleaned up and wrapped in bandaging from his kit, which seemed to work well enough, there was a long silence. Then VTH made a sound Earl couldn't reproduce, but the meaning was close enough to understand. Why? Earl thought about it. Because you needed help, he said. That's the only reason there is. He picked up his toolbox and his duct tape and nodded toward the ship. What was broken was nearly everything. The ship's propulsion system, which Vet spent 20 minutes trying to explain using hand gestures and diagrams scratched in the dirt, had failed in a way Earl didn't fully understand, but recognized in principle. Something that should have been maintaining pressure wasn't. Something that should have been cycling energy was stuck. The breach in the hull was leaking atmosphere at a rate that would make the ship uninhabitable within hours. And the communications array, the most critical system for reaching whoever they needed to reach, was physically disconnected from its power source by a snap in what appeared to be the primary conduit running along the ship's spine. Earl spent 2 hours inside the ship. The inside of the ship was extraordinary. He noticed this the way he noticed the landscape on approach to an objective, registered, catalogued. Later, he would sit on his porch and try to process what he'd seen, and he would largely fail. But in the moment, he focused on what mattered: systems, connections, what was intact and what wasn't, what was structural and what was functional. The alien crew watched him move through their ship with expressions he couldn't read, but understood the shape of. They were the expressions of people who had been told their situation was hopeless, watching someone refuse to receive that information. Earl crouched at the break in the primary conduit. It was at its most basic level a severed connection between 2 components that needed to be joined. The materials were not anything he recognized, But the principle was not complicated. He looked at it for a long time. Then he reached into his toolbox, pulled out a roll of duct tape, and got to work. Veith lost his composure completely. He understood intellectually that watching an alien creature wrap primitive adhesive tape around components of your advanced spacecraft was an experience that required considerable trust. He would have felt the same way. He gave Veith full credit for not physically stopping him. But the sound VTH made, urgent, alarmed, gesturing at the tape and then at the conduit with an expression of absolute disbelief, was clear enough. Earl held up the tape. He pulled a strip off slowly. He pressed it against his own palm and pulled it away to show the adhesion. He pressed it against the conduit and showed how it conformed to the shape. He pointed at the break and made the universal gesture for connection. Two fists separated, brought together. Theth stared. He made another sound, quieter this time. "I know," Earl said. "Bear with me." The truth, which Earl understood clearly, even if he couldn't explain it in any language VTH spoke, was this duct tape worked because it was designed to create a temporary high adhesion barrier between two surfaces. It worked on metal, on rubber, on plastic, on anything with a reasonably flat surface. It worked in heat and cold. It worked under pressure. The alien conduit had a smooth exterior, and the break was clean, a separation, not a disintegration. The tape wouldn't fix the underlying system, but it would hold the conduit together long enough for the system to function, which was all he needed. He worked methodically. He wrapped the break in 7 overlapping layers, staggered for strength. He reinforced the connection points on both sides. He ran a second line along the full length of the conduit, where the casing had stress fractures from the impact. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at it. "Now try it," he said. The communications array came online with a sound like a chord played on an instrument no human had ever built. Deep, harmonic, resonant in a frequency Earl felt more in his chest than heard with his ears. Lights came on across the ship's interior that hadn't been on before. The injured Sarah, lying on a makeshift rest the crew had built near the hatch, opened her eyes and said something that the others responded to with visible relief. Vet stood at what was clearly the command console, operating controls that Earl watched with the focused attention of a man who knows he is seeing something he will never see again. The alien commander's hands moved with precision and urgency, and whatever he was transmitting it fast. Earl went back to the hull breach. This was a bigger problem. The breach was about 3 meters long and irregularly shaped, and he had not brought enough duct tape to seal it from the inside in a way that would hold against pressure differential. He solved this by also using the emergency thermal blanket from his first aid kit, his spare work jacket, and what turned out to be the most critical item in his truck bed, a partial roll of aluminum foil tape he had bought 8 months ago to reseal ductwork in his cabin and never gotten around to using. The combination held. He knew it wouldn't hold forever. He also knew it didn't need to. Vish found him as he was finishing. The alien commander stood in the breach area and looked at the repair. The overlapping foil tape, the silver emergency blanket stretched and fixed beneath it, the duct tape borders holding the whole assembly against the hull, and was silent for a very long time. Then he said something. Earl didn't know the word, but he recognized the tone. It was the tone of a commanding officer who has just watched a subordinate do something that should not have worked and is revising several assumptions simultaneously. "My grandfather taught me," Earl said. "If you've got tape and time, you've got options." VH tilted his head. He seemed to be trying to replicate the sentence in whatever internal translation was happening. Then the ship's alert system screamed. They came from the north, dropping through the cloud layer at an angle that made Earl's stomach drop, not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen attack approaches before. The angle, the speed, the deliberate spacing between craft. This was not a search pattern. This was an assault formation. 3 ships larger than Vetha's vessel, moving with the precision of a coordinated strike. Earl counted them, assessed the speed, looked at the terrain. He turned to Veith. "Who are they?" Vex's expression answered the question before any gesture could. The amber eyes went flat and hard, and the alien commander moved to the weapons console with the controlled urgency of someone who had already calculated the odds and didn't like them. The ship's weapons were offline. Earl didn't need Vey to tell him. The console lights were wrong. The responses too slow. The whole weapon system still drawing power from a grid that his repairs had only partially restored. They had minimal power. They did not have the ability to fight back. Earl looked at the approaching ships. He looked at the terrain, the ridge, the treeing, the long trench the crash had carved. He looked at his truck. He looked at his toolbox. How long until your people respond to that signal? Vys held up 4 fingers, then tapped his wrist where a human would wear a watch. 4 hours. The enemy ships were maybe 20 minutes out. Earl did the math. Okay, he said. He was already moving. Here's what we're going to do. The plan had 4 parts. Earl explained them using the dirt drawing method he had developed over the past 4 hours of communication. Drawing fast and pointing at the terrain and the ships and the men. The crew, all 5 of them now, since Sarah had insisted on being helped upright, and she turned out to be, even injured, the second largest person in any room. And they got it. They were soldiers. Different species, different world, different everything. But soldiers recognized a briefing when they saw one. Part 1 was the trench. The impact trench was 200 meters long, 3 meters deep, and ran roughly northeast to southwest. It was already dug. Earl had not dug it, but it was there. And a defensive fighting position that's already dug is one of the most valuable things in any engagement. He walked the crew through it, positioned them, used hand signals they seemed to understand instinctively because hand signals for stay down and watch that direction are not actually that culturally specific. Part 2 was the truck. Earl drove his truck to the eastern end of the trench, positioning it broadside to be expected approach, which gave it 0 military value as cover, but significant value as what Earl actually needed it for, a distraction and a mount for the 2 floodlights he pulled from the truck bed and rigged to the battery using jumper cables. The lights were bright enough to be temporarily blinding at 50 meters. He pointed them northeast. Part 3 was the hull. The breach repair was holding, but one section of the loosened hull plating, a panel about 2 meters wide that had been partially torn away by the crash and was now hanging at a 45-degree angle, was with 6 people and considerable effort able to be repositioned. Earl had them angle it northwest. It would catch light from above at speed. It would read as a different signature than the damaged ship. Part 4 was Earl. They waited in the trench. 17 minutes. Earl had always been good at waiting. He had spent years of his life waiting in positions, in vehicles, in rooms with no windows. Waiting was not the absence of action. Waiting was the action when the action required it. He crouched in the trench and breathed slowly, and watched the sky go from dark to darker where the cloud layer was thickening to the north. Beside him, Vys crouched in the same posture. Earl noticed at some point during the wait that the alien commander had adopted his specific way of crouching. Weight on the balls of the feet, forearms on knees, eyes at the horizon. He hadn't done it consciously. Soldiers absorbed each other. Earl glanced at him. Vys's amber eyes were steady. Not calm exactly. He could see the tension in the set of the alien's jaw, if jaw was the right word for it, but controlled, deliberate. Whatever he had fought, wherever he had fought it, this man, this person had been in positions like this and come out of them. Earl gave him a single nod. Fh returned it exactly. The clouds to the north lit up orange. "Here we go," Earl said. The enemy ships did not fire immediately. Earl had counted on this. They were looking for survivors from the crash, which meant they needed to identify the target before they destroyed it. They swept low on their first pass, 200 feet, maybe less, and Earl watched from the trench as their searchlights moved across the ridge. The searchlights found the repositioned hull panel first. That was the point. The panel angled to catch light gave a strong reflection from a position 30 meters north of the actual ship. It looked from above and at speed like a partially intact vessel. The enemy ship circled it, discussed it, whatever their equivalent of discussing was. Earl clicked on the floodlights. 2 million candle power pointed northeast directly into the approach vector. The effect on alien ships was not identical to the effect on human pilots, but the principle was sound. Sudden, intense, unexpected light source on approach disrupts sensors before it disrupts anything biological. The lead ship pulled up sharply, its approach angle broken, its sweep pattern disrupted. The other two responded to the leader, which was exactly how coordinated assault formations responded to disruption. They followed the lead ship, which meant they followed it away from the actual vessel. That box 3 minutes. 3 minutes was what Earl needed. He was already moving. The communications array was still active. VH had left it transmitting on an open frequency. Earl had made sure he understood this part of the plan clearly, using the most emphatic dirt drawings he had produced all night, which meant the enemy ships knew exactly where the signal was coming from. They would come back to it. They were coming back now. The disruption recovered, reforming into their assault pattern 2 ridges north. But the signal VTH had been transmitting for the past 4 hours had been received. Earl knew this because VTH had told him. 4 fingers, tapped wrist, and then a 5th gesture Earl hadn't seen before. Something fluid and downward with the right hand, which he had interpreted as arrival and hoped he was right about. He was in the ship at the communications console with no idea how to operate it. He looked at it the way he had looked at every system he'd ever had to learn fast. Not trying to understand it completely, but looking for the thing that was obviously a transmitter, the thing that was obviously a frequency control, the thing that was obviously a broadcast. Systems built by people who needed to use them had logic to them. Not the same logic, not always intuitive logic, but logic. He found 3 components that seemed like the right candidates. He operated them in sequence loudly in English because it didn't matter what he said, and he wanted something going out on every frequency that system touched. This is Earl Hicks, retired gunnery sergeant, United States Marine Corps. I am at the crash site. We have 3 hostile ships on approach. If anyone is receiving this, now would be a very good time. He said it 4 times. Then the ridge to the north lit up white. They came out of the cloud layer like something from a dream that hadn't decided whether to be a good dream or a nightmare. 7 ships, large, moving in a formation that was nothing like the enemy's assault pattern. A formation that Earl's eye told him was something between an escort and an interception. They were fast. They were organized. They had clearly been moving toward this position for hours, and they arrived at exactly the moment that the 3 enemy ships were beginning their second descent toward the crash site. What happened next was not a battle. Earl had been in battles. What he watched from the trench, Veith beside him, the rest of the crew behind them, Sarah upright and refusing to be anything else, was not a battle in any sense that word usually carried. The 7 ships deployed with a precision that reduced the tactical situation to a statement of math. The 3 enemy vessels responded first with aggression, and then very quickly with something else. They withdrew, not destroyed, withdrawn. Earl watched them go. He thought about that, about the difference between an enemy that was destroyed and an enemy that chose to leave. The second one was more interesting. The second one was a decision. Decisions meant something you could work with later. The largest of the 7 ships descended toward the ridge, moving with a slowness that suggested deliberate care, and set down 200 meters from the crash site with a competence that made the original landing look catastrophically bad. Many figures came out. Theth walked toward them. There were sounds exchanged that Earl didn't follow. A reunion happening in a language he didn't speak, about events he had only partially been part of. He stood back. That was correct. This was their moment. But then Vayath turned, and he spoke to the figures from the new ship, and he gestured, and he said something Earl caught no part of, except that he clearly said it twice with emphasis, pointing at the duct-taped hull, pointing at the foil tape and the thermal blanket, pointing at the trench and the truck. The figures from the new ship looked at Earl. One of them, older Earl thought, though he was guessing on alien age, walked toward him and stopped 3 feet away and looked at him for a long time. Then the old alien reached into a pouch at its side and removed something small and placed it with great deliberateness in Earl's open hand. It was a small disc, dark metal or something like it, with markings he couldn't read. VTH appeared at his elbow. He mimed talking. He pointed at the disc. He pointed at Earl. He made the gesture Earl had learned meant important. Then he made a gesture Earl had not seen before. Hands together, then opened outward, then arms spread wide. Earl looked at the disc in his hand. He looked at the burning crash site, the duct-taped hull, the foil repair catching the first gray light of Montana morning. His cold coffee was still on the porch. 11 miles south. He looked at VTH. "You're going to need the tape back, aren't you?" VTH tilted his head. Earl reached into his toolbox and pulled out the 2 remaining rolls. He held them out. After a moment, Veach took them with both hands in a grip Earl recognized as the grip of someone accepting something they intend to keep safe. And somewhere above Montana, in the growing light of a morning the world knew nothing about yet, a small war ended, without anyone on Earth being told it had begun. Earl Hicks drove home. He made fresh coffee. He sat on the porch. The stars, for the first time in a long while, looked exactly